This is a victory of more than arms alone. This is a victory of liberty over tyranny. Back of it all were the will and spirit and determination of a free people who know what freedom is and who know that it is worth whatever price they had to pay to preserve it. It was the spirit of liberty which gave us our armed strength and which made our men invincible in battle. We now know that that spirit of liberty, the freedom of the individual, and the personal dignity of man are the strongest and toughest and most enduring forces in all the world.
Hello, and welcome to Coming Together, Coming Apart, Episode 3, Original Sin. Today we are discussing the Soviet and American plans for Korea before the end of the war and why division was the final decision in 1945. Before that, I want to take care of some basic knowledge that I've overlooked so far to ensure we're all starting from the same place. The last two episodes I talked a lot about Japan and China's interest in the peninsula, but I didn't really explain how these places fit together. The Korean peninsula is the largest of three peninsulas sticking out from the northern Chinese mainland, but it is the only one whose inhabitants are ethnically distinct from its neighbors. Thus, Koreans in Korea have existed and have been acknowledged for thousands of years. The peninsula itself kind of looks like a slightly curved rectangle in the north-south direction, attached at the top to a smaller rectangle at an east-west slant. The northern border butts up against Manchuria and northeastern China, along the Yalu River in the west and the Tumen River in the east. In the northeasternmost corner, there is a short border with Russia's Far East territory. The southeasternmost corner lies across the Straits of Tsushima from the southwesternmost edge of the Japanese home islands. The Yellow Sea lies to the west and the Sea of Japan to the east of the peninsula. The peninsula is very mountainous, especially along its eastern spine, making regular agricultural practices difficult in a decent portion of the country. Seoul, the largest city, sits centrally near the west coast of the peninsula. Northern Korea is much better suited to dry agriculture, like wheat, compared to the southern half, where wet agriculture, like rice, is more common. Because wet agriculture requires a great many more hands, the population of southern Korea is about twice as large as that of northern Korea. This also means that, although southern Korea has a large population and decent agricultural output, much of the industrial development done by the Japanese is in the north, closer to raw mineral resources and cheaper land not as well suited to agriculture. It's fitting that the peninsula lies almost perfectly between Tokyo and Beijing, with northern Korea in line with the Chinese capital and southern Korea in line with the Japanese capital. But we'll see why that's poetic soon enough. This episode was originally titled A House Divided, from the famous Abraham Lincoln quote, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." But, without getting too far ahead of myself, the two Koreas somehow have stood in spite of division. It is from this original sin, from the early decision on division and the later inability to reunify the peninsula, that modern Korea has struggled to survive against itself. There were not always two Koreas. The current state of affairs was a conscious decision that was then made worse through subsequent decisions. The term original sin is drawn from the biblical story of Adam and Eve eating the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge in Eden, placing humanity in a state of sin ever since. As one could consider a forced division of a homogeneous people a state of sin, politically speaking. Every country, I think, has an original sin, some aspect of its origin as a modern state that it has either had to work very hard to overcome or has failed to fully reckon with. Examples include structural racism in the United States, imperialism in the United Kingdom, or militarism in Germany. That being said, of all the possible paths not taken in 1945, why division? Korea was liberated by the Allied powers as part of the surrender of Japan on August 15, 1945. This meant that, importantly, Koreans were not able to lift themselves out from under the colonial thumb before the Japanese surrender. There was no unifying event or set of events to bring the country together. There was no symbol of Korean independence on the peninsula. The argument could be made that independence leaders in exile were those symbols, but that doesn't really hold up when you realize that most Koreans still in Korea had little knowledge or concern about what the exiles did, as they never changed the condition of those living in Korea. The divisions that existed in colonial Korea, between rich and poor, between collaborators and non-collaborators, between educated and non-educated, still existed in post-colonial Korea. Importantly, Koreans did not have the opportunity to work those divisions out like they would through an armed struggle for independence. War breeds odd bedfellows, and, of course, unification against an external enemy would not necessarily breed continued cooperation, But war is an emotional event that builds relationships between those willing to fight for each other. I'm not saying violence is an answer for what I think are mostly reasonable political disagreements between factions, or that states cannot exist with internal divisions, but a fight for independence against a colonizer allows a state to define its purpose from the very beginning and build a national identity throughout its core population. Korea, of course, had a national identity before colonialism, but there was never the opportunity to really build a political facet to this identity alongside the cultural and social components in the ways that occurred in most other post-colonial states. Therefore, the division imposed on the Korean Peninsula and the Korean people by the United States and Soviet Union is the original sin of modern Korea. Although there have been many confounding factors since the division, an undivided Korea would at least have a better opportunity for unified prosperity than the divided solution agreed upon by non-Koreans in the 1940s. It is a game of historical what could have been with a unified Korea, where it is hard to match idealistic intentions and realistic expectations. Could nationalists on the right and left work together to build a unified Korea? Maybe. Could a unified Korea still split apart or undergo a massive upheaval of violence? Possibly. Were they ever really given the opportunity to decide for themselves? No. Almost as soon as the Japanese carrier fleet sank beneath the waves near Midway in early 1942, American diplomatic and military policy planners began thinking about how post-war East Asia would look. Korea was just a small piece of this puzzle, and little knowledge readily existed about what that piece actually looked like. What did exist was a choice between three options for a post-war peninsula: a Korean-led independent government, a multilateral and international trusteeship, or a full military occupation. Each of these options deserves a full discussion to understand the background and implications of each, because each option leads to what I think are wildly different outcomes. That is why we will talk about two of these, trusteeship and occupation, this week, and leave the independent government to next week's discussion because I want to give it all the time it deserves. First, let's talk about trusteeship. Trusteeship was an administrative system very much in the Wilsonian, post-Great War, League of Nations mold of decolonization and de-imperialization. It involved placing former colonies under the administration of the great powers, allowing those powers to shape indigenous governance structures in whatever ways they saw fit. Then, after this period of tutelage gave the former colony a group of trained professionals who could properly, in the opinion of the trustees, administrate the country, independence would be granted by the benevolent and gracious trustees. Frankly, this was colonialism in progressive clothes. Trusteeship was the preferred method of decolonization of U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt. This is because, as Bruce Cummings describes in his tome-like Volume 1 of Origins of the Korean War, trusteeship fulfilled both Roosevelt's desire to open the world market to increase trade with the United States and his Wilsonian ideals of liberal internationalism. The impetus for trusteeship came from a need to at least attempt to keep the Grand Alliance of World War II together after the war against a common enemy ended. Had trusteeship taken effect in Korea, the United States, China, the Soviet Union, and potentially Great Britain would have each played a role in the occupation and administration of Korea until the time was right for Korean independence. Trusteeship in Korea was not a cornerstone of American diplomatic efforts before the Japanese surrender, nor was it given much, if any, thought between annexation in 1910 and Pearl Harbor in 1941. It did not enter the conversation until the beginning of World War II, as the internal battle between two strains of diplomatic thought Cummings describes as nationalism and internationalism began in earnest. Nationalist diplomacy focuses solely on a zero-sum, what-can-you-do-for-me view of the world, with national interests narrowly defined and pursued. Internationalist diplomacy searches more for areas of mutual benefit, even if those benefits are still paternalistic and lopsided. Both were distinctly capitalist, but nationalist diplomacy organized the world into regional spheres of influence, and internationalist diplomacy advocated for the total opening of markets to global trade. To illustrate this point more clearly, nationalist diplomats tended towards the hard power of guns and ships, while internationalist diplomats tended towards the soft power of culture and education. This battle was largely ignored until the death of Roosevelt in April 1945 that moved Harry Truman into the White House. But that's getting a bit ahead of myself. Roosevelt advocated for trusteeship and for his new international system in a way that largely ignored the line bureaucrats at the State Department and the desires of his allies that still held colonial empires. He principally wanted to incorporate the Soviets into the Anglo-American system and make them responsible for global security in a cooperative manner. Neither Roosevelt nor Stalin seemed to have any deep interest in Korea, so cooperation was most possible on the peninsula, even if it would have been difficult elsewhere. Neither Britain nor France supported trusteeship, almost entirely because they viewed it as a mechanism for the United States to eventually usurp the power they held over their colonies. Those living in the colonies targeted for trusteeship, including Koreans, would probably say trusteeship was colonialism by another name. At the end of the day, they still don't have control of their own affairs and are subject to the will of other countries with their own interests and goals. This is especially shown by the Korean response to the Cairo Declaration of November 1943. In it, the US, Britain, and Republic of China stated, quote, "They are determined that Korea shall, in due course, become free and independent," end quote. This statement irked independence-minded Koreans. They understood the intention behind "in due course" and rejected the hypothesis of it all. In their mind, Korea was an old nation and Koreans had ruled themselves for thousands of years. What makes post-colonial Korea any different? And honestly, I think that's a valid question. American intentions with this statement were a mix of paternalistic benevolence and political gamesmanship. While the United States did want a Korea under the influence of American ideals like the right to self-determination, it also wanted, 1, to push the Chinese towards stability that would allow them to play a larger role in the security of post-war Asia, and 2, to incorporate new markets into the American-led global economy. This wording of the Cairo Declaration was important and highlights the divide within the Allies of what Korea's future should be. The first draft stated that Korean independence should occur at the earliest possible moment, which was then changed to at the proper moment, which was finally changed to in due course. Each was a meaningful change that pushed Korean independence further towards an indeterminate future date. While I don't exactly know if Roosevelt or Churchill or any other Allied leader discussed a specific length of time for Korean trusteeship in Cairo, Roosevelt later says that Stalin agreed that Korean trusteeship would need to last at least 40 years to properly prepare Koreans for independence. That's a bit apocryphal, as Stalin later replied to Roosevelt's desire for a 30-year trusteeship at Yalta in February of 1945 by saying that he wanted as short a trusteeship as possible. Basically, while Stalin agreed that trusteeship could work, he did not want it nearly as long as his capitalist allies. At this same meeting, Churchill further expressed his frustration and hatred for trusteeship, forcing the Americans to state that trusteeship was not meant for British colonies. This was again cemented in the United Nations Charter signed in San Francisco in June later that year. Trusteeship would apply to a limited set of territories, specifically those former League of Nations mandates from the end of the Great War, former Axis colonies, and to other colonies voluntarily placed into trusteeship by their colonizer. There was also an exemption that allowed colonizers and Allied powers to place military bases anywhere they deemed strategically necessary in captured lands. This is because within the US government, it generally broke down so that military leadership was against trusteeship. The US Armed Forces, most of all the Navy, desperately wanted to keep as many of the captured Pacific Islands as possible to strengthen the defensive net of the region, strictly oriented towards the US West Coast. I can't say for sure, but I think it is not illogical to say that this urge probably comes from the Navy not wanting to be embarrassed again like they were in 1941, mixed with the usual fight for power between the Navy and the Army. Roosevelt's death in April 1945 reversed the fortunes of trusteeship. Harry Truman, the new president, was not the internationalist Roosevelt was, nor was he as adept a diplomat as Roosevelt. He leaned on his predecessor's advisors, especially those that more closely matched his generally nationalist worldview, allowing them to push the policies they really supported but could not implement under Roosevelt. The new policies did not fully come into play during one advisor's May 1945 trip to Moscow, where Stalin agreed to the proposal of a four-power trusteeship of Korea. This agreement, importantly, was not in writing. As Germany surrendered and the full might of the Soviets began to turn eastward, there was no formal agreement in place between the Allies on what would happen in Korea after the defeat of the Japanese. This was especially distressing to the policy wonks at the State Department, who decided that they needed to secure some form of agreement at the upcoming Potsdam Conference. They figured the target outcome was for the Soviets to agree to trusteeship, and the worst acceptable outcome was for the Soviets to agree to the admittedly vapid terms of the Cairo Declaration. Once in Potsdam, Stalin himself said Korea was a great place to initially try out trusteeship. Churchill responded by mentioning trusteeship for the Italian colonies in northern Africa. Stalin responded to that by asking which powers would take place in the trusteeship of such territories, and Churchill, fly in the ointment he was, stated he had not considered that the Soviets would want any land in Africa. Discussions on trusteeship pretty much fell apart after that, and even though Truman was advised to press hard on the matter, all agreed to put the topic aside and move on to other pressing matters. Trusteeship was not to be brought up again between the Allies until a non-executive ministerial meeting in December of 1945. We, too, will leave trusteeship more or less alone until we talk about that meeting in a couple weeks. It's understandable that, without Roosevelt's ardent promotion and with the personal differences between Allied leaders, trusteeship would fall out of favor all around. After the failure to reach an agreement at Potsdam, American policy planners began to plan for a different outcome. In the American military mind, Japan would be a cornerstone of the American defensive perimeter in the Pacific. If you remember from our first episode, Korea is a dagger pointing right at Japan, meaning that it was a dagger that could slice open that defensive perimeter. This would be especially true if Korea was anything less than ardently pro-American, whether that was full Soviet control or just an ambivalent independent government. From this, American planners drew the conclusions that any American presence, either a military occupation or a joint administration with the Soviets, was preferred over all else. Even then, could the Soviets really be trusted? For all intents and purposes, yes, they pretty much could be trusted. This could have happened if it were not the early stages of a long and violent ideological conflict not yet known as the Cold War. As far as I can tell from Catherine Weathersby's 1993 paper on the topic drawing on official Soviet documents, Soviet goals in East Asia were in line with the Russian tradition of identifying spheres of influence between great powers and building enough of a territorial buffer to allow the armed forces to push back any threats from the border. In a planning document written before the Potsdam Conference, 5 specific conclusions are reached by 2 area experts in the Soviet Foreign Ministry. 1. Russia lost the Russo-Japanese War because they lacked the military strength and diplomatic support to effectively counter Japanese expansion. 2. Japanese influence in Korea was a direct threat to the security of Soviet borders in East Asia. 3. Independence was alright so long as an independent Korea could not be used as a base for attacks on the Soviet Union, especially by the Japanese. This was best ensured through a tight relationship between an independent Korean state and the Soviet Union. 4. Sino-American interests could be in conflict with Soviet interests in Korea depending on the nature of Japan's surrender. I think it's important to remember at this point that China was still Republican and allied to the Americans and not yet taken over by communists. And 5. The Soviet Union must be a prominent force in any trusteeship scheme. To further drive home the point that there was a heavy shake of Russian tradition and Soviet goals in East Asia, Japan was identified as the main concern in each of these points, while the Sino-American dyad was of lesser direct concern. This was further cemented when Red Army General A.I. Antonov asked U.S. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall if there were plans to land U.S. forces in Korea. When Marshall responded in the negative, Antonov suggested that the U.S. take on naval and aerial responsibility for peninsular operations while the Soviets would take full responsibility on the ground. The Americans did not agree to this as they still expected to invade the Japanese home islands and incur a high physical cost in the process. These were highly complex negotiations with lots of best options, best alternatives, contingent reservation points, and big personalities. Their outcome would determine the future of an entire people and set a precedent for other post-war independence movements in formerly Axis-controlled areas. Which is why, at this exact moment, the wheels of compromise slowly, then all at once, ground to a halt. In the absence of an agreement on trusteeship, what could be done? We still have 2 other options: full military occupation and full independence. Again, though, we'll discuss what full independence could be next week. For now, let's talk about what was planned at the time for an occupied Korea. American leadership had no idea what the Soviets had planned for Korea. A 1944 planning document surmised that there were 35,000 Soviet Koreans prepared to drive into Seoul and Sovietize the country at a moment's notice. This is not really true, but it's important to understand the information policy planners were working with in 1945. Occupation, as considered for the short term, was at least a roadblock to the worst intentions of the Soviets, and at most a stopgap until trusteeship could be implemented. As seen from Washington, the perceived Soviet desire for control of the Korean Peninsula was a disastrous disturbance to the geopolitical stability of the region. This desire, though, was part of the Russian diplomatic tradition going back to the days of the Tsars. The much greater upset in the region was that the Americans were interested in Korea. This was entirely new and different in the scheme of East Asian geopolitics. They did not care much about Korea until they were forced to by the eventual circumstances of Japanese defeat and the fear of Soviet involvement in the war against Japan. All that considered, this was still to be a joint occupation with the Soviets. As the war in the Pacific ground to a close through Okinawa and the Philippines, the Americans were in a bit of a bind. They were still searching for a way to bring the war to a quick end. An invasion of the Japanese home islands would be incredibly costly. Heck, the amount of Purple Hearts manufactured for the expected number of casualties in the invasion lasted at least until the year 2000. One way to lower the costs of an invasion of the home islands was to get the Soviets to invade from the Asian mainland. Even then, any invasion of Korea was expected to go to the Soviets alone. A recently developed atom bomb prevented things from going to plan. The 2 atom bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th, when considered with the collapse of the Kwantung Army in Manchuria against the Soviets, pushed the Japanese to consider surrender much sooner than anyone expected. This only occurred, though, because of the combination of the A-bomb and the onslaught. Either one in isolation may not have led to such a quick collapse. Such nuance was not understood by American leaders in Potsdam 1 month earlier, though, who called off negotiations on the Soviet entrance into the Pacific War after the first successful test of an atom bomb. Thus, after the 2 atomic bombings and the quick run of Soviet success in Manchuria and Korea, the State War Navy Coordinating Committee that steered the implementation of the American war effort at the highest levels faced a dilemma. An invasion of the home islands was no longer necessary, but a few decisions that were put off until a later date now needed to be made immediately. One of those decisions was the fate of Korea. In the late night hours of an overnight meeting on the night of August 10th, Major Dean Rusk and Colonel Charles Bonesteel, which is one of the coolest names I've ever heard, were tasked with finding a place to divide the Korean peninsula. Everything north of the line would be occupied by the Soviets, and everything south of the line would be occupied by the Americans. They had just 30 minutes to find a line that was acceptable to the State Department, who wanted the line as far north as it could be to maximize American influence in Korea, and the War and Navy departments, who wanted a more conservative line, considering the Soviets could just ignore it and occupy the entire peninsula if sufficiently annoyed or angered. Using the only map they could find, a National Geographic wall map, they originally wanted to follow provincial boundaries northeast from Seoul. Instead, Chuck pointed out that the 38th parallel was easy to relay and roughly halfway, and thus the boundary between 2 Koreas was born. Dean Rusk's memoirs contain some interesting details about this night that forever changed the course of Korean history. Rusk, who had served in the army earlier in the war in the Southeast Asian theater, believed the Soviets did not deserve any occupation zones in the Asia-Pacific theaters, including Manchuria and Korea. The U.S. Army, for its part, did not want any occupation in mainland Asia. They were prepared to give up the entirety of Manchuria and Korea to the Soviets because of the great effort it would take to transport U.S. Army personnel to those areas in any quick fashion. Rusk and his compatriots in the committee also failed to understand, at the time, the symbolism of the 38th parallel to the Soviets. It was the same line the Russians and Japanese discussed before the Russo-Japanese War to divide their respective spheres of influence in Korea. This symbolism, as Rusk assumes was perceived by the Soviets, signaled that future negotiations on unification were to be seen, in his words, as mere show. We'll get to those talks in a couple weeks. Dividing the peninsula at the 38th parallel placed about 2/3 of the population, the capital city of Seoul, and most of the agricultural output of the country into the hands of the Americans. With northern Korea, the Soviets gained raw materials, well-developed and export-oriented industrial development, and a buffer zone against the Japanese they have always desired. All 3 departments agreed with the line, and the offer was cabled to Moscow. The 38th parallel was not cemented as the boundary just yet, though. The Soviets still needed to agree to the line. Shockingly, they accepted the boundary with neither complaint nor question. I was absolutely gobsmacked when I found this out, and I was even more gobsmacked when I slowly realized no one really knows why. I read about a half dozen different historians' writings on this decision, and most shake it off with a short sentence and a wave of the hand. Maybe I'm just not looking in the right places, but just 2, Bruce Cummings and Catherine Weathersby, say anything significant about what I think is a defining moment in the early Cold War. Weathersby, in her 1993 paper, states that Stalin quickly approved the agreement without discussion. Cummings, in Origins of the Korean War, gives it a bit more breathing room, a full paragraph. Such a decision would be taken directly to Stalin. So what are the potential reasons he accepted it without any discussion among his closest advisors or military leaders? I think it's a combination of a few different reasons. First, the main Soviet concern was to keep potential enemies away from Soviet borders. A buffer state in northern Korea satisfied that requirement. Second, Stalin might have wanted to maintain a modicum of cooperation with his Anglo-American allies. The battle lines of the Cold War had not yet calcified. The Soviets also might have thought there was still a possibility for a joint occupation of the Japanese home islands. According to Dean Rusk, there was not. Third, Stalin was less concerned with post-war Asia than he was with post-war Europe. Most of the Soviet population lived in the West, and it was the direct route of 3 major and devastating invasions in the last 150 years or so. Much more could be done to protect Soviet interests and capabilities in Europe than could be done in East Asia, especially considering the large amount of Soviet blood spilled to defeat the Nazis in Europe. Lastly, Stalin had only slightly more knowledge than the rest of the world about the potential of the atom bomb. The 2 mushroom clouds over the Japanese home islands might have blinded Stalin just enough that he didn't totally realize the dominant position of Soviet troops in Korea. This amounts to Stalin failing to call the bluff of the Americans, although it was less of a bluff about the potential to place armed forces in Korea than it was a massive reach to ask for something the Americans could not otherwise receive. As bureaucrats a few thousand miles away decided their fate, what were Koreans doing to make their own way? The question must be asked. Were the Americans and Soviets conquerors or liberators? Could they be both? What was Korea like between the Japanese surrender and the arrival of their new occupiers? These are all questions we will discuss in next week's episode. Before I end, however, I just wanted to mention who you heard at the top of today's episode. That was Harry Truman announcing the surrender of Japan. I'm incredibly grateful that there's a big database of American speeches at AmericanRhetoric.com, like the one given by Douglas MacArthur aboard the battleship Missouri at the surrender ceremony you heard last week. I was able to find a quality recording of Emperor Hirohito's radio address announcing the surrender without actually saying the word surrender, but it's entirely in Japanese, a language I can neither speak nor read. If you would like to hear the full speech, I'll find a way to put it up on the website, on Twitter, and on Facebook with a translation for those of you in a similar boat to me. And with that, we will end our show today with the agreement to divide Korea, a country that had stood unified for much of its history. Next week, we will discuss what Koreans wanted their post-colonial future to look like, and how it began to unravel with the arrival of the American and Soviet occupations. If you're on social media, you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook as @CTCA Podcast. If you're not on social media, you can find more information, including the references for today's episode, at ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. That's ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. We release new episodes every Tuesday. Please be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. I am Trevor Owens, and this is Coming Together, Coming Apart. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week.